Thank you very much. Somebody let me know that I was on mute on YouTube. So, all right. So let me just go ahead and get started with this. So this particular lecture, Roots of Racism, we are covering week 2 for this particular class. And with week 2, we are talking about the new Jim Crow. So most of this lecture is going to be about the new Jim Crow. And this is going to cover both chapters 1 and 2. So the thing with the new Jim Crow is that it is a very, very heavy book to read. It is a very thorough book. And even for us to cover just chapters 1 and 2 in this particular session doesn't do it justice. And this is one of these things that I'm probably going to have to look at doing a whole course on, and doing a course like that. So a whole course on the new Jim Crow would probably be about a 12-week long course, something that's much longer than just the roots of racism. But part of the reason for going into this is to start looking at just the racism, just prejudice, bias, discrimination. But this is going to set some of the discussions up for what we go into for the next week and the next week after that. So let me start off with something that's just from Michelle Alexander, just to begin with. So let's go from there.
Even though studies have now consistently shown for decades that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites, this drug war has been waged almost exclusively on Black and brown communities. And federal drug forfeiture laws allow state and local law enforcement agencies to keep for their own use up to 80% of the cash, cars, homes seized from suspected drug offenders. You don't have to be convicted, just suspected of a drug offense. And law enforcement can seize the cash out of your pocket, out of your home, take your car, sell it, keep the proceeds, thus giving law enforcement a direct monetary interest, not in ending drug abuse or drug addiction or drug-related harm, but in the longevity of this war itself. And the U.S. Supreme Court, far from resisting the rise of mass incarceration and the targeting of poor communities of color, the U.S. Supreme Court has eviscerated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, giving the police license to stop, frisk, search just about anyone, anywhere, without a shred of evidence of any criminal activity, as long as they get consent, which is really just compliance. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, my own view is that nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration in the United States.
So in the new Jim Crow, let's start off with one of the excerpts that she put in her book. And she mentioned that in the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals, and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it once was legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial to the right to vote, denial of educational opportunities, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you are afforded scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. And she goes on to say on page 26 in chapter 1, any candid observer of American racial history must acknowledge that racism is highly adaptable. And on page 50, she mentions that proponents of racial hierarchy found they could install a new racial caste system without violating the laws or the new limits acceptable political discourse by demanding law and order rather than segregation forever. Now, yes, that is correct, Tiffany. So when we start looking at what is the new Jim Crow, it's basically how we can still enforce those old Jim Crow laws when we start talking about mass incarceration, and then you start talking about what it means to actually be black or brown in America. And then we start looking into how they're able to kind of keep this systemic racism alive. Once you become a criminal, once you become a convict, unless you are the president of the United States, apparently, you lose all of your rights to just about everything. And then they're still able to kind of keep people subjugated just for the simple label of being criminal. So we're going to break this little discussion up into about four parts. We're going to cover the first half of chapter 1, the second half of chapter 1, the first half of chapter 2, and then the second half of chapter 2. And so in the first half of chapter 1, what we see is that Michelle Alexander opens up with the idea of subjugation of blacks and whatever form it has pretty much taken. It has been done to create a lowest racialized caste, basically, thereby ensuring the continuation of basically white privilege. So looking back at the history of the United States, we can see that the system of racial subjugation and the rules of the game have changed over time. So it's not like all of this stuff has remained the same. It's just that in order to kind of keep the game moving afoot, and when you start looking at the prison complex and where you have privatized prisons and the money that goes there, and how you have other people, where you're using the prisoners to either put out fires in California or you're using them to create license plates. There's all types of things that prisoners are being used for, and it's basically legalized slavery. So Michelle basically asserts that each iteration of the American caste system has been less complete and less capable of total control than the ones before, but also more resilient and shielded from challenge because the racism at its roots is better disguised. So what I'm talking about is basically that we still have this racialized system that's in place, that it's there despite the fact that it will be illegal if it was explicit. But if it's like kind of hidden and it's not actually out in view, then people are okay with it. They're okay with this racialized system of oppression being in place because it's basically going towards a group of people that they don't necessarily care for. So the discussion that follows reviews the history of this racial caste system and in the colonies and the United States. So beginning with the indentured servitude of early black arrivals and the implementation of racialized slavery to fulfill labor demand. So this is one of those things that I was talking about. When you start looking at the firefighters that are in California, how much do you think they actually get paid to put out those fires? They're not getting minimum wage, I can assure you. These people that are putting out the fires that are, incarcerated individuals, they're getting pennies on the dollar in order to do that. And this is barely enough to afford the things that they need, even like bars of soap, or when you start looking at socks and shoes and stuff. If they're getting pennies on the dollar to be out there to fight these fires for hours and hours at a time, this is still legalized slavery. So Michelle explains how racialized slavery was used by the wealthy to drive a wedge between black and poor whites, who might otherwise have been mutually sympathetic and share a desire to revolt against the wealthier classes. In short, racialized slavery gave poor whites feelings of superiority over blacks, and poor whites became deeply invested in these feelings. So, also continue with chapter 1, you start looking at, throughout the centuries of slavery, the ideology of racial hierarchy became increasingly ingrained to the point of fervor. When slavery ended, the racist ideology did not. And that's what we're seeing today. Just because people can claim that we're in a post-racial society or racist society doesn't mean we actually are. It doesn't mean that something that happened less than 100 years ago when people were fighting for their rights just went away. It has never gone away. So the southern states were economically, politically, and socially decimated, and the establishment of a new racial caste became a consuming passion of whites who mourned the loss of privilege and feared black insurrection. So you start looking at the success of blacks during Reconstruction, and you start looking at all of the things that kind of happened. You've heard these things in passing, for instance, like Black Wall Street. And you start talking about the communities that were spread throughout the United States. And so when you start talking about the success of blacks during Reconstruction, you have to understand that undermined the racial caste system that was being set up. And so what ended up happening? They ended up destroying it by bombing those towns, by killing those people, by hanging them. This is a lot of stuff that just kind of happened over time. But it was all because we have broken down the racial caste system during that time. And so when the political structure, so basically when Reconstruction fell apart, thanks to the abandonment by the North, Southern whites took back full control of the social, economic, and political structure and began to pass segregation laws. So in the late 1800s, an agricultural and economic depression gave rise to a populist political movement that reunited poor whites and blacks. In response, Southern conservatives used segregation laws, the framework of the new racial caste system, as a new wedge between whites and blacks, and Jim Crow grew even harsher and more deeply entrenched. So all of this stuff didn't come overnight. It came over a series of moves, and there was things that just kind of pushed it along. With first, we start talking about the 1800s, and you go into the Reconstruction era, and you start seeing how, poor whites and blacks started getting along. Then they had to drive a wedge in between that because they want to make sure that a certain group of people, they had to support this racial caste system. They wanted to make sure that a certain group of people was separated and always separated. So Jim Crow was basically weakened by World War II. So the weakening of it didn't just come out of nowhere. It was weakened by World War II thanks to the cognitive dissonance created by black men serving in the military, but having no rights at home, and the comparison of American treatment of blacks to Nazi treatment of Jews. So Americans, at least in the North, were growing increasingly uncomfortable with the racial caste system. It's not like everybody in the South was bad and everybody in the North was good. No, they were basically turning a blind eye to it. And so what happens when you start turning a blind eye to things? If you just keep ignoring it, it's not going to go away. So the Supreme Court's decision in the Brown versus Board of Education brought federal control into this picture, ending the ability of the states to create their own racial caste system. With the Civil Rights Movement and its many achievements, Jim Crow crumbled. But Michelle notes that even during the Civil Rights Movement, the groundwork was being laid for the next iteration of America's racial caste system with the new language of law and order. So this is, you see that Jim Crow never, it was weakened, it kind of went away, and then the powers that be had to find another way for it to come back. And not only come back, but come back in a way that it was legalized, that it wasn't going to get any type of criticism. So one of the things that Michelle wrote in her book, in The New Jim Crow, she says that once again, in response to a major disruption in the prevailing racial order, this time the civil rights gains of the 1960s, a new system of racialized social control was created by exploiting vulnerabilities and racial resentments of poor and working class whites. More than 2 million people found themselves behind bars at the turn of the 20th century, and millions more were relegated to the margins of mainstream society, banished to a political and social space not unlike Jim Crow, where discrimination in employment, housing, and access to education was perfectly legal, and where they could be denied the right to vote. Yet, the mass incarceration of communities of color was explained in race-neutral terms, an adaptation to the needs and demands of the current political climate. So as we start looking at the second half of chapter 1, Michelle Alexander discusses the beginning and early rise of mass incarceration in the mid to late 20th century. Among some politicians and media outlets, the movements of African Americans from the South to the North cities gave rise to the talk of crime waves. I'm not sure if you guys remember that. That's something that's been coming up with regards to the immigrants coming in here. And they're talking about them coming from, Ecuador and Peru and Mexico and Guatemala and so on and so forth. They're talking about there's going to be these crime waves because they wanted to instill fear into people. And so in those cities, some civil rights activities were labeled as criminal. And you're probably going to see the same thing that's going to start happening now as people start pushing back against the government and they start pushing back against their politicians, because there are things that are happening right now that people aren't necessarily enjoying. It's not necessarily about the cost of food. It's a loss of economic opportunity as well. But you also have rights being stripped away. What happens when you have people in political power that says, I'm going to completely ignore the balance of power with regards to this part of the Constitution? And then people start to protest against it. Well, it's going to be labeled as criminal. And it's not only going to just be criminal, they're going to start locking people up for it. And who do you think benefit? Because the prison industry is $1 billion industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So poverty was often viewed as a problem of character and culture rather than a problem with the economic system. When the Black Panther Party rose in the late 1960s, it was seen as a violent and communist threat rather than a local provider of safety and services. So in his 1968 bid for the presidency, Richard Nixon made it clear that he was the law and order. Sound like anybody as of right now? He was the law and order candidate who would put down black riots in cities, which occurred in the wake of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And get control of inner city criminals. He wanted white votes, and he got them by playing the racist grudges of poor whites, just as conservatives have done 70 years later. If there's anything that you can pick up, at least from chapter 1 of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, you can understand that the same playbook that Richard Nixon has and used is the same playbook that Trump is using today. So in the 1970s and 80s, the factory jobs, which paid comfortably and did not require higher education, began disappearing. And poverty spread in the cities of the North. Black communities were particularly hard hit and had little in the way of a safety net. So during the Reagan years, African Americans were portrayed as welfare cheats, welfare queens, relying on handouts instead of working and abusing loopholes in the system. Now, according to Michelle Alexander, President Reagan's 1982 Declaration on the War on Drugs was a major step in establishing the latest system of racial control, incarceration and post-incarceration removal of rights. She asserts that drugs were not a primary public concern at the time, and the intent was racist instead. Thus, the dice were loaded when cracks appeared in 1984. Crack was cheap and gave a quick high, making it popular in poor communities. It devastated black neighborhoods. And this was a place where the jobs had already dried up, and poverty was systemic. Mind you, the United States, the greatest country in the world, it's not like we don't have the money, we don't have the funds to make sure that when it comes down to people being able to buy the things that they need, or even having a universal basic income, it's not because we don't have any of this stuff. If we can have somebody that's on the verge of becoming a trillionaire in this economy, and they have billionaires with more money than the rest of the 99% of the people, if you have that much wealth in the United States alone, it lets you know that poverty is definitely systemic. Why should we continue to give money to these people that's using it to just benefit themselves? But I digress. So, the response by politicians was more law and order rather than prevention and treatment. Remember that if you go look at a lot of our politicians, they have money invested into the prison complex, the prison system. And that's how they make their money. So it is basically on them to kind of keep this perpetuation of this racial caste going on. If there's always people that's in the prison, they're always getting paid. So when we start looking at law and order from the prison system and our politicians, when they definitely have the money for prevention and treatment, just know that it's a mutual benefit to them. So the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 established mandatory minimum sentencing for drug crimes and gave harsher sentences for crack than for his cousin, cocaine. Why? Because crack use was prevalent in the black communities. This is how you make laws and you push them out so that only one group of people end up getting punished the most, even though the use is equal between both sides. So in 1988, more federal laws were passed expanding the use of the death penalty for drug crimes. So why would they do that? So they established new mandatory minimums, adding civil penalties. Democrats got on board with harsh drug laws in order to wrest power from the Republicans, and doing so allowed them to appeal to poor whites who felt threatened by affirmative action in a tight job market. Bill Clinton established 3 strikes and you're out sentencing, tightened welfare rules, diverted money into the prison construction, and brought about rules allowing federal housing authorities to keep out those with a criminal record. So under Clinton, funding for federal housing was slashed by $17 billion. That's a lot of money. That was 61% at the time. While funding for corrections was increased by $19 billion, and that's 121%. So here's some questions for you. Like crack in the 1980s, the opioid crisis is receiving extensive public and government attention, But the response to opioids has been largely focused on public health and treatment rather than mandatory minimum sentencing and the death penalty. This is a positive response in many ways, but it's because we've learned about addiction and criminalization. Or is it because of what we learned about addiction is basically what I'm saying, and criminalization? Or is it simply because opioids are hitting white rural communities instead of black urban communities? On another note, does the decriminalization of marijuana have anything to teach us about racism? This is something that you have to think about, because at first, when it was just black communities using crack, and it was just black communities being hooked on drugs, it was all about harsher laws, harsher regulations, making sure that people get locked up for a minimum amount of time. And then there's a 3 strikes you're out law. And then it was followed up by this opioid epidemic that came out. But once the opioid epidemic came out, and we saw that it wasn't really affecting black people, it was affecting whites in rural communities, it changed. So you also have to look at the decriminalization of marijuana. The majority of the people that were getting locked up for marijuana were basically black people. Have we learned anything just from those experiences? Because there are tons of people locked up for marijuana, and they were all black. So let's move on to chapter 2, and let's have a bit of a discussion on chapter 2, because like I said, it's a lot to cover in a small amount of time. And so given that we have to go over chapters 1 and 2 this week, and this book isn't the whole course, but it does set the foundation for it. So Michelle writes in her book that with only a few exceptions, the Supreme Court has seized every opportunity to facilitate the drug war, primarily by eviscerating Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures by the police. The rollback has been so pronounced that some commentators charge that a virtual drug exception now exists to the Bill of Rights. So Michelle looks primarily at searches and arrests starting on chapter 2, noting how much these police activities have changed since the outset of the war on drugs, and how the Supreme Court has enabled these changes and thereby mass incarceration through its interpretation of the Fourth Amendment. Before getting into the legal details, because this is not necessarily a law class, but before getting into the legal interesting. So apparently having this particular discussion has limited my live. So, but before getting into the details on this and the Fourth Amendment and stuff, Michelle Alexander reminds us that in just 20 years from 1980 to 2000, the prison population went from 300,000 to over more than 2 million. And by 2007, 1 in every 31 adults was in jail, on probation, or on parole. So Michelle begins her investigation of the change in police searches with Terry versus Ohio, the 1968 Supreme Court decision that allows police, when they observe something that causes reasonable articulable suspicion that criminal conduct is occurring, can stop the person and question them. The police can also search the person for weapons to ensure the safety of the officers. Today, stop and frisk have become commonplace in some neighborhoods, and in effect, no longer require any kind of suspicion or criminal activity. Yes, I understand that, Shelby. But it's kind of hard to really just kind of tiptoe around a lot of this stuff, which is why I'm glad that there is YouTube as well. So a lot of the stuff will be on YouTube, but I can deal with the less of a viewership on TikTok as long as that I'm able to just kind of get the message through. That's why I've always kind of pushed out that TikTok is not necessarily a platform where you can kind of get the information out there or teach classes, because you're going to be limited in one way or another. So when we start looking at the Supreme Court's decision in Florida versus Bostic, and how that paved the way for police to conduct sweep searches, basically they are systematically searching everyone and their luggage on the bus, right? Without individualized suspicion. The court determined that these searches were consensual because a reasonable person under the same circumstances would feel free to say no to the police if they did not want to be searched. The Supreme Court also gave its blessing to pretext stops where the police pull over the driver for a minor traffic violation and then, despite having no evidence of drug activity, turn the event into a search of the person and the entire vehicle. So Michelle goes on to then ask an astute question: why do the police do all of this for what are often minor offenses or minor crimes when they have bigger and more violent crimes to worry about? There's only one answer for that. And it's simple. It's money. All of this has to do with money. So the federal government gives states and the local police huge cash grants for enforcement. But not for any other crimes, though. So another big incentive is equipment. So leftovers from the military. As a result, police departments have placed an outsized focus on drug-related crimes and have done so with military-grade helicopters, assault rifles, grenade launchers, and night goggles. Why does the police need any of this? But heavily armed and armored SWAT teams, originally intended for a terrorist threat, and hostage situations are now used to serve search and arrest warrants. Where do you think these pieces of equipment are being used out of? In what communities? We know exactly which communities, because they're not going into rich white neighborhoods with this equipment to go serve a search warrant. It's basically in poor, black, people of color, Latino, those communities. So police are also incentivized by the fact that police departments often get to keep the assets of those suspected of drug-related activity. This includes cash, cars, bank accounts, and more. And here's the thing: you do not have to be guilty of a crime in order to have your assets forfeited. So earlier when I was talking about Florida versus Bostic, in which they decided that a reasonable person would feel free to tell the police that they did not consent to having a bag searched during the bus search sweep, what color skin would this reasonable person have? Should skin color matter when determining what a reasonable person would do? And what about gender? Michelle Alexander wrote that tens of thousands of poor people go to jail every year without ever talking to a lawyer. And those who do not meet with a lawyer for a drug offense often spend only a few minutes discussing their case and options before making a decision that will profoundly affect the rest of their lives. She also noted that a Louisiana man was convicted of a second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after meeting with a public defender for just 11 minutes before trial. We left off last week talking about racism, discrimination, bias, colorism, classism, and we were talking about just a general overview of all of these things. And when we start having these conversations, we understand that when we start looking at racism, it's prejudice plus power. And then when you start looking at discrimination, then you're looking at belief plus action. And we started defining all these things. But let's take a look at how all this stuff is basically interconnected. So when I was just talking about forfeiture, in which property used in or resulting from a crime is seized and kept by law enforcement, you have to understand who this is happening to. Now, it happens to pretty much anybody and everybody, but you have to look at what demographic. So laws passed in the mid-1980s expanded forfeiture, leading to confiscation of property regardless of wrongdoing. The availability of forfeiture also led to corruption, the use of pretextual stops, or even planting evidence in order to seize valuable property. Now, when you don't have anything, more than likely, if somebody takes the only thing that you have, what's going to end up happening? Well, you're going to end up pretty much homeless. You're not going to have, a vehicle or any of this other stuff. But the Civil Asset Forfeiture Reform Act of 2000 made some improvements, but didn't go far enough, according to Michelle. So, for example, family members of someone who commits a crime can lose shared property. And the reforms left family members and other innocents with little recourse. And hiring an attorney to fight the forfeiture is too costly for most poor people. So what do you think is going to happen? They just lose their stuff. So the greatest failure of the 2000 law is that it left the profit motive for law enforcement intact. They were able to do this without anything ever happening to them, and they kept the money. They kept the property, be it a car, be it a house or any other property. Having surveyed problems in arrest and searches, Michelle goes on to then switch to post-arrest issues. So fundamental to problems in the post-arrest proceedings in the woefully underfunded public defender system, funding for and quality of public defenders varies widely across states and municipalities, and it does not come close to matching the support for and numbers of prosecutors. Eligibility for a public defender varies too. So if you look at the example of Wisconsin, where anyone earning more than shockingly low amounts of $3,000 per year is ineligible. If you make more than $3,000 per year, you are ineligible for a public defender. And that isn't even what the poverty line is. But it says if you have any type of amount of money, you are ineligible for that. So plea bargaining is another area riddled with problems that leads to mass incarceration. Prosecutors hold all the cards and have nearly unlimited discretion. A typical result is overcharging. A prosecutor charges a defendant with a range of crimes, many of which could perhaps not be proved in court, in order to get the defendant to plead one or more of the lesser crimes and/or provide information in exchange for dropping the more severe charges. This happens all the time. This brings the discussion to a severity of sentences, which Michelle Alexander urges is too extreme. In particular, she points to decades-long sentences for nonviolent crimes. and three strikes laws that impose very long or life sentences for minor nonviolent crimes. There used to be, there was this article that I remember reading. It was talking about a guy that, it was actually a young kid that stole something out of a store. And it was so menial what he stole, but because of the three strikes law, he ended up going in for over a decade. Does that make sense? If you steal something like candy or food or something like that, does this three strikes law make sense at the end of the day? So in the United States, they diverge sharply from other developed countries and from its own history. So prior to the Drug Reform Act of 1986, the longest sentence Congress had ever imposed for possession of any drug in any amount of 1 year. Even our judges have protested the cruelty of extreme mandatory minimums. So, around 95% of all criminal convictions, 98% of federal and 94% of state, result from plea bargains. In this sign of a criminal justice system that is working efficiently and cost effectively, or one that is severely strained, that it has to resort to questionable tactics to keep functioning. So does this mean that we are doing a great job? Are there ways that we could allow for plea bargaining but protect the innocent from ending up in the untenable situation of having to plead? When we started, one of the reasons I brought up the case of the Central Park Five in this week's reading is to make sure that we understand what is going on with our system. Is it simply because people are being justly evaluated for their crimes and then they're being justly sentenced? No, not at all. What's ending up happening is that you have certain people of a certain racial caste are being subjugated to these laws and these restrictions and everything, and they are basically out there to punish them so that they can keep the prison complex continuing to run. And they do so by saying, hey, we may not have proof that you've done a crime, but we're going to charge you with the crime anyway. So you can either take the plea deal, and you can take this plea deal and serve this amount of time, or we're going to take you to court and we're going to charge you for the full amount, and we're going to just throw the book at you. And we already know that you're not going to be able to defend yourself because you don't have the money for a lawyer. This is what we're looking at in our society today. It's not necessarily only poor blacks or even Latinos or anything else like that. You also have it happen to poor whites. So it's not just only blacks, it's everybody else as well. But what happens when you have a system that is set up to subjugate one group of people legally? It's legalized prejudice, it's legalized racism, it's legalized discrimination. What happens? Well, you have the majority of people that's going to be incarcerated of one certain racial caste. And then everybody else, because there is this cognitive dissonance out there that says, all right, this person is in jail for a crime, and therefore I believe they should be put in jail. Just as you had with Trump when he came out and he put out a full-page ad for the bringing back of the death penalty because of the Central Park Five. And they just recently asked Trump about that and whether he feels any remorse or whether he feels guilty. And he says that they're guilty. To this day, he is still saying that they're guilty and that they should have been incarcerated. They should have been given the death penalty, despite the fact that they were completely exonerated. This is how people with money think. It's not about law and order. It's not about social justice. It's not about making sure that everybody is on an equal plane and that everybody is going to have the same ability to be able to defend themselves. It is not about making sure that the people that have done the crimes are going to be punished for those crimes. This is about making sure that there is a certain racial cast of people that have always been punished and criminalized, continue to be punished and criminalized. This is what it means. So when we start looking at the beginning of the Jim Crow laws, when we start coming back from the 1800s and you start making your way into the 1900s, and then you see it's always changing. It's like, all right, so Brown versus Board of Education has come along. What do? Well, we changed the law so that now we can legally do this. We can legally take their Fourth Amendment protections away. The Bill of Rights, something that everybody can enjoy in this country, does not apply to everybody in this country. So next week, we're going to start going into chapters 3 and 4 of this, and we're going to start looking at a few other things as well. But I want people to kind of take this into mind as we start looking at what it means to actually be of somebody of a different racial caste. And don't think that this only happens in the United States. Oh, it happens elsewhere. It happened in apartheid South Africa. It's happened in Germany. It's happened, and it's not necessarily with black people. It has happened in China. It has happened throughout Australia. You always have people who are always treated differently than the rest of the population, and it's always because those are in charge. In our society, in the United States, we now see that it's the oligarchy. Those people who have billions and billions of dollars that are paying for the prisons to be built. And then they're giving kickbacks to politicians to make sure that these laws are constantly being changed so that you can continue putting people in prison. Because think, if we ever got a time where we started doing treatment and reformation, prisons wouldn't exist. Or there would be a lot fewer of them. But prison is a big business. It is a huge business. And as long as you start, as long as you have these people that's going to be making money off of it, even when you start looking at our senators and you start looking at our representatives and stuff, it's always going to be a big business because they're going to make sure that they pass laws that's going to get them kickbacks, because just about every person that's in Congress is a millionaire. And you can't necessarily think, you cannot necessarily think or believe for 1 second that these people are going to care about your well-being. And this is one of the things that you have to worry about, because we're not millionaires. We're not billionaires. The laws aren't, they're meant to keep us subjugated, but the laws don't apply to them. Because how many other people do you think that a black person or a Latino person or in Native American or First Nations, do you think that they will be able to commit a crime, be convicted, and still be elected president? Not at all. Because the laws aren't meant for them, it's meant for us. As I'm coming towards the end of this particular lecture, are there any questions, even specifically about the book and stuff that we just reviewed? Because we've only covered the first 2 chapters. And like I said, I might have to just do a whole class just on this book alone, because it covers so much and it would never do it justice to just really just kind of deep dive into it. But is there any questions that I could probably address with regards to this specific topic? And also, I thank everybody for hanging with me on this, because this is a new setup that I'm trying to do. And also, me trying to get used to the whole TikTok restrictions thing or whatever on saying some certain words, and I'm going to have to get used to that. But I was able to get everything up and running with TikTok and YouTube at the same time. I can see those people who are typing in messages on YouTube. I can see everything on TikTok, and probably try to expand this and also try to get it out there to share with other faculty and professors who are doing stuff with Hillman Talk, to make sure that we can all have similar experiences on how we learn. TikTok is great for short form videos. It's great for just kind of picking up stuff quickly. I don't think it's yes, the 13th is definitely part of for Shelby. 13th is definitely part of the course materials. I think it's either week 3 or week 4 in which the whole class is going to watch the video. So the whole class is going to watch the video. It is part of the course materials. It is something that we're going to deep dive into, because I think it's important that everybody watches that. And for some people, I had mentioned before, it's probably going to hit you like a ton of bricks. There's a lot of emotional material in there for people that's dealing with that type of subjugation or whatever. Yes, I am. I am putting everything into a playlist. I can't put it on a playlist onto TikTok because I don't have the amount of followers yet. But the playlist and everything that exists for this course is on YouTube, including the supplemental information as well. So all supplemental videos that I use for this course, they're all on the playlist. So if you go to my profile, click on that link, go to YouTube, you can find everything up under there. And I'm trying to get a bit better at making sure that everything that I share on TikTok, I'm sharing onto YouTube as well. But I think YouTube is going to be my primary source that I'm going to put up stuff. And I'll just probably just keep sharing, 3-minute videos or so for Reels and YouTube Shorts and TikTok, just to kind of keep it consistent. But as far as the actual course is concerned, the course is on Google Classroom. Anybody can get to that course, and then the videos, everything is going to be going up on YouTube. So just know there's a playlist on there. I have everything broken down by weeks. So the lectures that I put up on there, I tried to make sure that the lectures aren't as long. You have a 20 to 30 minute lecture. It's supplemented with other videos. It's supplemented with, some questions to make sure that you're really getting the information that you're learning. But also, I just want to make sure that, people are just kind of really enjoying themselves as well, because this is a heavy topic. You can't really have a conversation about this topic without people feeling a certain way. People have very strong feelings. And I remember being written and people saying, I don't think I can really take this course without really hating the oppressor once I come out of the course. And it's not about trying to make people hate anybody. It's trying to give everybody the education and the background on these topics so that we can understand where we come from, where we're going, and what's the current state of our country now with regards to this. I tell people, it's like, all right, we talk about the civil rights, but the civil rights movement wasn't 100 years ago, like some people think it was. Slavery wasn't that long ago. There are still people that have just passed away. They were still sharecroppers. They had parents who were still slaves. So we'll continue getting into this, and I'll try to see where this goes. I'm trying to get better on how I do everything and how I kind of put up the information, improving at least 2%. That's my whole thing. I improve on a regular basis. I try to make sure that I can at least do something a little bit better, whether it's how I present the information or how we do the quizzes or how we do the assignments. And just know I'm still going to be up doing the grading for the assignments tonight. So just know if you haven't had a grade for last week's stuff, it's coming. Otherwise, we'll call it 4 minutes early. I appreciate everybody being here. I appreciate your interaction. Thanks for those who hopped on YouTube. I had, at least 8 people or so on YouTube. I don't know how many I've had, at least with this one. But we'll continue doing this. We'll continue improving, and we'll continue learning as a class. I know that all of you guys had something to do with your own time, and I'm glad you joined. So let's go ahead and we'll continue pushing forward. We'll continue doing stuff, and we'll try to find the best medium on how we can do everything. But if there's ever any questions, always you can shoot me an email, you can shoot me a DM, you can shoot me a message on any of the other platforms. I'm here to answer your questions. And for some of you guys that's really pushing in on the work, I appreciate it, because I found a lot of the stuff that you've written very insightful. And so it's not just me teaching you guys, but I'm also learning from you guys as well. So otherwise, you guys have a good night, and we'll talk later. We'll talk in the classroom. We'll continue our discussions, and we'll just keep moving forward.